Good evening. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Welcome to Truth Report. Tonight, we're covering stories that expose a pattern the mainstream media won't connect for you, a pattern of erasure. Of indigenous leaders murdered for defending forests. Of scientists silenced for defending truth. Of entire cities demolished and rebuilt to erase memory itself.
We're going to take you deep into 5 interconnected stories spanning 3 continents. And by the end of this broadcast, you'll see what ties them together, who profits when defenders are eliminated, when history is rewritten, when science is defunded.
This isn't comfortable television. This is investigative journalism. We're going to name names, cite sources, and follow the money. Because in 2026, with our planet burning and authoritarianism rising, comfortable journalism is complicit journalism.
Let's start in Ukraine. Specifically, in Mariupol, a city you might think you know about. But what's happening there now, according to a major investigation published by Bellingcat, goes far beyond reconstruction. It's something closer to colonial occupation masked as humanitarian aid.
The numbers are staggering. According to the United Nations assessment cited in Bellingcat's report, 90% of Mariupol's residential buildings were damaged or destroyed during Russia's 86-day siege in 2022. The Kyiv School of Economics estimated $56 billion in housing damage across Ukraine, with Mariupol among the worst affected. We're talking about half of the city's 2,600 multi-story residential buildings reduced to rubble. 25,000 people dead.
Now here's where it gets sinister. Bellingcat's open-source investigation documented 23 multi-story housing complexes under construction, more than 50 buildings containing at least 6,000 apartments. Developments with names like the Leningrad Quarter, Mirapolis, Nevsky Estate. These aren't being built for the people who lived there. They're being built on top of their graves.
Let's talk about Victoria Morieva. She's a 57-year-old ecology professor who fled to Mariupol in 2014 after Russia occupied Donbass. She rebuilt her entire life there. Worked at Mariupol State University. Made a home. Then in March 2022, her apartment building was bombed. 7 of her neighbors were killed. She escaped to Ireland, and now she can't return.
And here's the mechanism of dispossession that Bellingcat uncovered. Original residents who lost their homes face a compensation cap of just €12,000 for single-person households, €16,000 for families. Meanwhile, the cheapest apartments in these new Russian developments? €45,000. Going up to €130,000. Do the math, the compensation doesn't even cover 1/3 of the minimum price.
But it gets worse. As of August 2025, Russia declared 550,000 properties in occupied Ukraine as ownerless. To reclaim their property, displaced residents must become Russian citizens, present ownership documents in person, which means traveling to occupied territory, and navigate a system where streets have been renamed and original addresses altered, deliberately complicating ownership claims.
Morieva put it plainly, they are building houses on bones. They are building so that people cannot return. This isn't reconstruction. It's replacement. The new apartments are being sold to Russian citizens at subsidized 2% mortgage rates over 30 years, compared to roughly 20% standard rates inside Russia. This is incentivized colonization.
And the cultural erasure is systematic. Ukrainian street names replaced with Soviet-era names, Avenue of Peace becomes Lenin Avenue. Ukrainian monuments removed. Murals painted over. Ukrainian websites blocked, Russian television mandated. Mariupol has even been designated a twin city with St. Petersburg, cementing its absorption into Russian identity.
The UN Special Rapporteur on Housing, Professor Balakrishnan Rajagopal, characterized this destruction as grave war crimes and crimes against humanity, comparable to some of the worst examples from World War II. Under the Hague regulations, the seizure of private property in occupied territory is explicitly prohibited. What we're witnessing is not just a war crime in progress, it's a crime being normalized through real estate development.
Think about what that means. War crimes packaged as housing policy. Ethnic cleansing marketed as urban renewal. And the international community watches as Russia constructs entire neighborhoods designed to permanently erase the Ukrainian identity of a city that stood for centuries.
Now let's travel to Peru, where tomorrow, Tuesday, January 21st, 5 men will stand trial for the contract killing of an indigenous leader. His name was Quinto Enuma Alvarado. He was 50 years old, a Kichwa tribal leader. And he was murdered on November 29, 2023, because he defended his community's forest from illegal loggers and drug traffickers.
According to multiple reports carried by the Associated Press and covered extensively by organizations monitoring environmental defender violence, Enuma was returning from an event for indigenous defenders when he was ambushed. He was traveling by boat along a river route. He was shot. He fell into the river. Another community member was wounded but survived.
This trial matters because it's the first time Peruvian prosecutors are seeking life sentences under charges of contract killing for the murder of an indigenous environmental defender. According to the prosecution, they have forensic gunshot residue tests, witness testimony placing the accused at the scene, and evidence linking the suspects to individuals Enoma had repeatedly reported to authorities for illegal logging and drug trafficking.
Let's be absolutely clear about the context here. Between 2012 and 2024, according to data compiled by the Monitoring of the Andean Amazon Project, that's MAAP, 62 environmental defenders were killed in Peru. Most of them were indigenous leaders resisting illegal mining, logging, and drug trafficking. Between 2019 and 2024 alone, 11 environmental defenders were killed in the Ucayali region, followed by 8 in Huánuco.
A recent report documented 226 cases of indigenous defenders at risk between 2010 and 2024 in just 3 departments, Ucayali, Huánuco, and Loreto. And get this, Enoma had been granted a security detail under a state protection mechanism created in 2021. Those measures were never implemented. He asked for protection. The state said yes. Then they did nothing. And he was killed.
The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights granted precautionary measures to Enoma's community in early 2024, after his death, and UN rapporteurs have urged Peru to ensure justice. This trial is being closely watched by indigenous groups, environmental advocates, and international observers as a test of whether Peru can actually curb violence tied to illegal deforestation and drug trafficking in the Amazon.
Because here's the economic reality that drives this violence. A report revealed that over 20% of timber harvested in Peru in 2021 came from illegal origins. That's not small-scale poaching, that's an industrial black market. Illegal logging, drug trafficking, and gold mining generate billions, and when indigenous leaders like Enoma stand in the way, they get assassinated.
And almost no one faces consequences. That's why this trial matters. If the court hands down life sentences, it would mark an unprecedented outcome in Peru for the killing of an indigenous environmental defender. But one trial doesn't change a system where 226 defenders remain at risk, where logging cartels operate with impunity, where state protection is promised but never delivered.
Let's connect this to a story from Brazil. Her name was Nathalia Urban. She was a journalist and revolutionary who died in 2024 at just 37 years old. According to Brazil Wire, where she worked as a contributing editor, Urban spent her career covering what her colleagues called Brazil's darkest period in modern history.
The announcement of her death is brief but pointed. Her family, friends, and colleagues are calling for a full and proper police investigation into the events and circumstances that led to her death. She was hospitalized before she died in September 2024. The specifics aren't publicly detailed, but the call for investigation speaks volumes.
Urban covered the Lava Jato judicial process, elections, democratic crises, alleged coup plots, Brazil's tumultuous political landscape where journalists who expose corruption and authoritarianism face systematic threats. Brazil Wire described her as a guerrera, a warrior who fought fearlessly to let the truth be known.
And here's the pattern: indigenous leaders killed for defending forests, journalists dying under circumstances that demand investigation, scientists facing systematic defunding and intimidation. These are all forms of silencing. Different methods, same goal: eliminate the people who bear witness, who resist, who tell uncomfortable truths.
Which brings us to our fourth story, and this one cuts to the heart of why these silencings matter for planetary survival. A major piece published in Nature on January 20, 2026, that's today, argues that fossil fuel phase-out is not enough. Countries must actively remove atmospheric carbon.
Let's break down why this matters. Recent climate policy discussions, as reported in Nature and other scientific journals, emphasize that decarbonization alone is insufficient. The world has already breached the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limit. The 3-year average temperature exceeded 1.5 degrees for the first time ever in 2025. We're past the threshold. Crossing 1.5 degrees in the 10 to 20-year average is now, according to researchers, a matter of when, not if.
So the scientific consensus is clear. Reaching net zero emissions requires a near-complete phase-out of fossil fuel use before mid-century, with immediate annual emission reductions of at least 5%. But even if we do that, even if we stop emitting entirely, we still need carbon dioxide removal to bring temperatures back down after we hit net zero.
Here's the dangerous game being played. Research published in Nature Communications warns that planning for high carbon dioxide removal under a 2-degree target leads to minimal fossil fuel phase-out before mid-century. In other words, governments and corporations are using the promise of future carbon removal technology as an excuse to keep burning fossil fuels now.
And if large-scale carbon removal proves infeasible, which it very well might, the rapid transition required after mid-century would increase global stranded assets by 38%. That's tens of trillions of dollars in worthless fossil fuel infrastructure, economic chaos, and a scramble to decarbonize when it's far too late to avoid catastrophic warming.
The Boston Globe and other outlets have been covering this burn now remove later approach, and scientists are sounding the alarm. The benefits of not emitting carbon dioxide in the first place vastly outweigh any speculative technological fix. The clearest path to a safe and stable climate begins with rapid phase-out of fossil fuels, not betting on unproven carbon removal at scale.
So why aren't we doing it? Why are governments dragging their feet? Why are corporations still lobbying for fossil fuel expansion? Why is the discourse dominated by technological optimism rather than immediate action? Part of the answer lies in our fifth story, the systematic dismantling of the scientific infrastructure needed to sound the alarm.
Nature published another piece today, Every Aspect of My Work Life Has Changed, where scientists reflect on 1 year of Trump's second term. From education to pandemic preparedness to public health cuts, the past year has seen catastrophic stress on U.S. science. And when I say catastrophic, I'm not exaggerating.
President Trump asked Congress to make massive cuts to the 2026 budgets of major federal science agencies. A 37% reduction at the National Institutes of Health. More than 50% at the National Science Foundation. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention faced proposed funding reductions from $9.2 billion to $5.2 billion, a 44% cut.
The FDA lost almost 20% of its staff members. The CDC lost about 1/3. The administration fired thousands of government scientists, canceled billions of dollars in grants, and blocked funding for elite universities. More than 100 biotech leaders warned that these cuts could devastate the systems that fuel American innovation and global health leadership.
The number of early career grant awards fell in 2025 to its lowest point since 2016. Enrollments in PhD programs in the life and biomedical sciences flatlined in the fall of 2025. An entire generation of scientists is being lost, pushed out of research, forced into industry, leaving academia because there's no funding, no stability, no future.
And here's the kicker, Congress has so far refused the steepest cuts to the NIH budget and blocked a White House plan to consolidate its 27 institutes. But the damage is done. When you create an environment of chaos, when you fire thousands of researchers, when you politicize science to this degree, you don't need to pass every budget cut. You've already destroyed morale, trust, and institutional capacity.
So let's connect these 5 stories, because this is where investigative journalism matters. What do we see when we look at the whole picture? We see systematic elimination of those who resist extraction, indigenous leaders killed, journalists investigating state crimes dying under suspicious circumstances.
We see entire populations displaced and their histories erased through strategic reconstruction, Mariupol rebuilt as a Russian city, Ukrainian identity systematically destroyed, property seized under legal cover.
We see a climate crisis where the science is clear, stop burning fossil fuels now, don't bet on speculative technology, but the political and economic will to act is absent, in part because the infrastructure to produce and communicate that science is being deliberately destroyed.
And we see scientists silenced through budget cuts, firings, chaos. When you defund the CDC, NIH, NSF, when you lose 20% of FDA staff, a third of CDC staff, you're not just cutting budgets. You're eliminating the capacity to respond to pandemics, to conduct climate research, to independently verify industry claims, to speak truth to power.
This is a global pattern. Extractive industries, fossil fuels, illegal logging, mining, generate enormous profits. Those profits fund political influence, lobby for deregulation, finance paramilitary violence against indigenous defenders. States either participate directly or look the other way. And anyone who resists, whether they're defending a forest in Peru, reporting on corruption in Brazil, or researching climate science in the US, faces systematic elimination.
It's not a conspiracy. It's just capitalism at its most brutal, paired with authoritarianism at its most efficient. You don't need a secret cabal when economic incentives align. Companies want to extract resources without regulation. Politicians want campaign contributions and revolving door jobs. Paramilitary groups want money. And the people standing in the way, indigenous leaders, journalists, scientists, they're obstacles to be removed.
In Mariupol, Russian developers are literally building apartment complexes on mass graves, selling them to colonists at subsidized rates, and legally seizing the property of displaced Ukrainians who can never afford to return. That's not a side effect of war. That's the point. You don't just defeat a population, you replace them, erase their history, make return impossible.
In Peru, you have 226 documented cases of indigenous defenders at risk, 62 killed between 2012 and 2024, and almost no one held accountable until this one trial. Because holding loggers and traffickers accountable would require admitting that 20% of Peru's timber is illegal, that the state protection mechanism is a sham, that entire government departments are compromised by cartel money.
In the United States, you're watching the deliberate demolition of scientific infrastructure during a climate emergency. And it's not stupidity, it's strategy. If you want to keep extracting fossil fuels, you need to discredit climate science. If you want to deregulate industry, you need to eliminate the agencies that enforce regulations. If you want to ignore the next pandemic, you defund the CDC.
And globally, you're seeing journalists like Nathalia Urban dying under circumstances that demand investigation, because journalism that exposes corruption, that names the powerful, that traces the money, is just as dangerous to extractive systems as indigenous resistance or scientific research.
So what do? First, we name it. We stop treating these as separate stories. Mariupol's reconstruction, Quinto Enuma's assassination, Nathalia Urban's death, climate science under attack, pandemic preparedness dismantled, these are all chapters in the same book. The book is called Elimination of Resistance to Extraction.
Second, we support the people on the front lines. Indigenous-led conservation protects 80% of the world's biodiversity, according to extensive research. When you defend indigenous land rights, you're defending the planet's lungs. When you support independent journalism in authoritarian contexts, you're defending the truth itself. When you fund scientific research, you're defending our collective ability to understand and respond to existential threats.
Third, we follow the money. Every time an environmental defender is killed, ask who benefits. Every time a scientist is fired, ask which industries profit from their silence. Every time a city is demolished and reconstructed, ask who owns the new buildings. Because power doesn't hide, it just hopes you won't connect the dots.
The trial in Peru starts tomorrow. If prosecutors succeed in getting life sentences for contract killing of an indigenous defender, it could set a precedent. But one conviction doesn't change a system. It takes sustained pressure, international attention, support for indigenous autonomy, and consequences for states that promise protection and deliver none.
In Ukraine, Bellingcat's investigation provides detailed documentation that could support war crimes prosecutions, if there's ever political will to pursue them. The evidence is there. The Hague regulations are clear. What's missing is enforcement, because enforcement requires powerful states to prioritize justice over geopolitical convenience.
On climate, the science is unambiguous. We need 5% annual emission reductions starting now, near-complete fossil fuel phase-out before mid-century, and carbon dioxide removal to bring temperatures down after net zero. We don't need more studies. We need political systems that can act on the studies we have, and that requires scientific infrastructure, which is exactly what's being dismantled.
And in the United States, if you care about pandemic preparedness, about biomedical research, about having a functioning FDA and CDC, then the budget fights happening right now in Congress matter. When they propose 37% cuts to NIH, 50% cuts to NSF, 44% cuts to CDC, those aren't abstractions. Those are vaccines that won't be developed, outbreaks that won't be detected, diseases that won't be cured.
This is Truth Report. We don't do comforting news. We don't pretend these problems are separate, solvable with minor reforms, or that both sides have a point. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes one side is lying, profiting, killing. And sometimes journalism means saying that plainly.
Indigenous defenders are being assassinated by contract killers funded by illegal logging and drug cartels. Scientists are being systematically defunded and fired to eliminate oversight of industry and government. Entire populations are being displaced and replaced through strategic reconstruction that constitutes ethnic cleansing. Journalists investigating state crimes are dying under suspicious circumstances. And the planet is burning while fossil fuel companies lobby for more drilling and governments bet on speculative technology instead of cutting emissions now.
That's not opinion. That's documented fact, sourced from Bellingcat's open-source investigation, from Associated Press reporting on the Peru trial, from Brasilwire's coverage of journalist deaths in Brazil, from peer-reviewed research published in Nature, and from Nature's reporting on science funding cuts. We've cited our sources. Now the question is, what are you going to do with this information?
Because that's the test, isn't it? Knowing isn't enough. Outrage isn't enough. The systems that produce this violence, this erasure, this silencing, they're counting on you to feel overwhelmed, to look away, to decide it's too big or too far away or someone else's problem.
But it's not. When the Amazon burns, you breathe that smoke eventually. When scientists are silenced, you lose the capacity to understand threats before they kill you. When indigenous defenders are murdered, you lose the people protecting the ecosystems that regulate global climate. It's all connected. You're connected. We're all in the same system.
So support organizations defending indigenous land rights. Fund independent journalism in authoritarian contexts. Contact your representatives about science funding, demand they reject cuts to NIH, NSF, CDC, FDA. Support war crimes accountability for what's happening in Mariupol. Pay attention to the Peru trial. Connect these dots publicly, in conversation, online, wherever you have a voice.
And most importantly, don't let them make you numb. That's the goal of overwhelming violence, of systematic erasure, of endless bad news. Make you stop caring, stop paying attention, accept it as inevitable. That's how they win. Not by defeating resistance, but by exhausting it.
Quinto Enuma didn't stop resisting. He reported illegal logging for years, knowing the risk. Nathalia Urban kept investigating Brazil's darkest moments. Victoria Moriva is speaking out from Ireland about what happened to her city. Scientists are defending their work despite firings and funding cuts. That's not naive optimism, that's courage.
And journalism like this exists because people refuse to accept comfortable lies instead of uncomfortable truths. Bellingcat spent months documenting Mariupol's reconstruction through satellite imagery and open-source investigation. MAP tracked 62 killings across 12 years. Researchers published studies knowing their funding could be cut. That's the resistance, people doing the work anyway.
This has been Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. The pattern is clear. The question is whether we have the courage to see it, name it, and resist it. Because they're counting on our silence. Don't give it to them.
Investigative journalism continues. The truth persists. We'll see you next time.